everyone. Welcome to the very first video of the IMS Blast from the Past series. We're going to take up a few passages from CAT 2005. And the reason that I've selected this particular year is that this was a very special year for VARC. What used to happen at that time, of course, was that we never knew what the test is going to unfold. So you found out only when you actually opened your test booklet. So this year was quite a bit of a surprise. Instead of say about 25 questions, the number of VARC questions increased to about 40, and it also became pretty tough. Of course, the general feedback in that year from the students was that it was a really tough VARC section. The experts, of course, believed that it was moderately tough. Now, you can judge on your own. We are going to discuss only 2 passages with 4 questions each. So the format actually is very similar to what we have right now. The passages, however, are going to seem a little different to you because the first passage refers to events of, let's say, more than a decade and a half ago. However, you will be able to relate it to a lot of things that are happening right now, so it's still pretty relevant. What I really like about the first passage is that it is making use of a lot of references to history. So if you have an understanding of history, then this passage becomes very easy to understand. Even if you don't, it's still possible to do it, but it makes it a little bit more challenging. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to explain certain phrases that might help your understanding of similar passages in the future. It's anyway good general knowledge, but it also makes the passage far more interesting to read. Now, the first paragraph here says, crinoline and croquet are out. It's okay if you do not understand these words. And as yet, no political activists have thrown themselves in front of the royal horse on Derby Day. You see, by the time you've read the first 2 sentences, you wonder what is this talking about? Who are these activists and why are they throwing themselves anywhere? The important thing is that it's okay if you do not get it. Look at the transition words, the contrast indicators. For example, here it says, even so, some historians can spot the parallels. So what we're trying to say is that something that is happening today is similar to something that was happening in the past. It is a time of rapid technological change. It is a period when the dominance of the world's superpower is coming under threat. Now, I'm not sure if you understand which superpower we're talking about, but we're talking about the US, which we will understand very shortly. It is an epoch when prosperity masks underlying economic strain. So that time in which this passage appeared, it was a good time economically, but the author is trying to argue that yes, everything appears to be great, but it is hiding certain signs of strain. And crucially, it is a time when policymakers are confident that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. We need to recognize this statement as over the top and therefore perhaps a little bit sarcastic. The author is trying to say here that maybe we're a little bit too confident, because we do not see the underlying strain beneath all the prosperity. Welcome to the Edwardian summer of the second age of globalization. I think this last line probably trumps a lot of people because we don't know what Edwardian summer is and what is the second age of globalization. So these are the aspects that I would like to explain. Nevertheless, even without my explaining this, what we need to definitely understand is that the argument we're trying to make is that just like one of the past era, the Edwardian era probably, we may be living in a time of complacency or overconfidence where rapid technological advancement and a lot of prosperity is hiding underlying tensions. So now we have a big picture of what this paragraph talks about. Let's take a look at the part which might be confusing. For example, the last line. What is this Edwardian summer? The Edwardian summer actually refers to the time just before World War I. It was a time when Britain was flying high as the world superpower. There were certain other countries which were emerging as challenges, for example, Germany and the US, but Britain didn't really recognize them as challenges, So these were some of the conditions that led to a huge surprise for Britain when World War I actually broke out. And it is said that Britain was not really prepared for it. The reason it was not really prepared, and apparently no one saw it coming, was that everyone was kind of deluding themselves that everything is wonderful. And that is what the author is talking about. That was the first age of globalization. And now, at the time that the author is writing this article, we're in the second age of globalization, which is very similar to that time. So we are also confident that everything is going well. Apart from that, we fail to see that there are some socioeconomic and even geopolitical tensions, which somehow we are setting aside. We're saying, you know what, it's okay, everything else is fine. So that is why the author is trying to say that maybe we're not supposed to be as confident as we are right now. Now again, this is just a cautionary tale. The author is not saying stop doing something or do something. The author is just saying let's not be so relaxed about it. Now let's look at the second paragraph. Now let's get into the specifics. So here the author has started highlighting some reasons as to why they believe that things are not all well. Spare a moment to take stock of what's happening in the past few months. So in this paragraph, the author is trying to tell us that the oil price has shot up to about $65 a barrel. After that, it says that the accepted wisdom is that we shouldn't worry our little heads about that. The accepted wisdom is, this is what people generally believe, but this is not what the author thinks. The author believes that this is again being complacent and overconfident, because the accepted wisdom tells us that there are enough incentives in place that will probably bring back everything into balance. In other words, we expect the oil prices to go down because the supply and demand forces will kind of balance themselves out. And if you look at the last line, as Tommy Cooper used to say, just like that. Now, if you don't understand the reference, that's fine, because Tommy Cooper was a British comedian. Most of us would probably not know him, also because this is something that happened way back. But let's look at the argument. The argument here is that the author believes that oil prices are not likely to be corrected on their own, or at least it will not be easy. So whatever the accepted wisdom might be, the author does not agree with it. But let's also look at the Tommy Cooper example. See, Tommy Cooper was, again, as I said, a British comedian. Now he had this special trick where he used to perform some magic and he used to say just like that, and the magic trick always failed. So when the author refers to Tommy Cooper, he's trying to say that just like Tommy Cooper's failed magic tricks, oil prices are not going to correct themselves. The magic will not work. Now let's move on to the third paragraph. Now the third paragraph also throws up a few challenges. Then there is the result of the French referendum on the European Constitution, seen as thick-headed Luddites railing vainly against the modern world. So clearly, the French had a referendum. Referendum is a form of direct democracy in which you get to vote for or against an issue. Now, I'm sure that a lot of us became a lot more aware of this word in the context of Brexit. But here also, we are talking about a similar thing that happened way back. Now, what are they voting on? Apparently, they are voting against certain reforms. So, when Europe got united, obviously all the countries needed to agree to certain measures. The French apparently are not in agreement. Now, here again we need to understand the rest of it. What is thick-headed Luddites railing vainly against the modern world? Luddites were people in the past, again, they were specifically British textile workers who were very unhappy when mechanization was introduced in the textile industry. This was, of course, at the time of the Industrial Revolution. Now, to some extent, their concerns were valid because they believed that it will threaten their jobs and maybe bring down their wages as well. So what they did was that they broke up a lot of or destroyed a lot of machinery in an effort to probably protest against mechanization. So when we say that the French are being seen as thick-headed Luddites, basically we are saying that they should just get in line. These reforms are part of the process. We need to go through with them, just like mechanization was something that had to be done. These reforms are something that have to be done. So they shouldn't really be protesting. Again, not the author's view, the general view that the author is probably criticizing. What the French needed to realize, the argument went, was that there was no alternative to the reforms that would make the country more flexible, more competitive, more dynamic. Everyone thinks that the reforms are great. Why are the French protesting against it? Then, look at the last line. An alternative way of looking at the French no is that our neighbors translate flexibility as you're fired. So these reforms, according to the French, will threaten job security, and that is why they were not in favor. Now, if I have to summarize the argument here, we're trying to say that the French rejection of the European Constitution or the reforms that were part of the European Constitution generally reflects some degree of skepticism or distrust against the economic reforms. Why? Because they think that these reforms are just another way of saying that you can be fired anytime, and therefore they're not in favor. Let's keep going. It's a very long passage. In this paragraph, there is that reference to Luddites, which I've already explained, but you have to understand again that Luddites railing vainly against the modern world. Here the word vainly means uselessly, unnecessarily. So if you look at the French as Luddites, you're basically saying that they are not being rational. So as I said, the Luddites were English textile workers who were protesting against mechanization. In that process, they destroyed a lot of equipment and machinery, and people generally thought that was not the right way to go, as in the case of the French. Let's look at paragraph 4 now. Very, very long passage. Finally, take a squint at the United States. Now, if you remember, at the very beginning, we talked about how there is some challenge to the world superpower, which in this case is the US. Just like Britain a century ago, a period of unquestioned superiority is drawing to a close. So now there are challenges to the global power structure. Who is challenging it? For example, China. China is still a long way from matching America's wealth, but it is growing at a stupendous rate, and economic strength brings geopolitical clout. So we're just trying to say that just like Britain refused to acknowledge that the global power structure was changing, and that perhaps countries like the US and Germany could possibly change that geopolitical situation, currently also we need to take cognizance of the fact that China ultimately is going to gain in power and influence. Now, if you look at the same article more than a decade down the line, you would say that that is absolutely true. This author was pretty prescient, because that is what is happening. And if you look at the rest of it, the author justifies why he or she believes that the US might lose power and influence. We are saying that beneath the surface of the US economy, all is not well. Growth looks healthy, but competition from China and elsewhere has meant that the world's biggest economy now imports far more than it exports. And then the last line talks about something like a current account deficit. If you notice, we are also again referring to complacency. The word complacency means overconfidence, which definitely is not good. So here, when we have a current account deficit, which normally should not be a good thing, it is seen as a sign of strength, not weakness, and the author clearly again disagrees with that view. So the argument that we are making here again is that just like Britain a century ago, the US is also being challenged. It's going to or is facing competition from China, and the primary reason for this is China's growing economic clout as compared to the economic imbalances that we are seeing in the American economy. But here, there's one more term that I think you should definitely know. What is a current account deficit? Well, it's a very easy term, so I'll just define it right here. It refers to the trade balance. So if you have a deficit, it is equal to saying that you're importing more than you're exporting. In other words, you are a net borrower from the rest of the world. Now think about it. If you were a net borrower, should you be happy about that situation? Not really. But since we are living in an era of complacency, we think, okay, that's fine too, no problem. Now we have paragraph 5. Looks like a lot of reading to do. But here again, we are talking about oil prices. So we had already said earlier that oil prices are on the rise. In this new Edwardian summer, this era of overconfidence, comfort is taken from the fact that dearer or more expensive oil has not had the savage inflationary consequences of 1973 to 1974, when fourfold increase brought an abrupt end to a post-war boom. So we are saying that yes, oil prices are going up, but the consequences are not really that bad. But the author is again trying to say, okay, I will agree that they're not so bad, but it is still putting a strain on the economy. So if you look at line number 3, true, the cost of living has been affected by higher transport costs, but we are talking of inflation at 2.3% and not 27%. So again, people are generally trying to say that things are not as bad as it might seem or it could have been. And the author is trying to say, but we should be concerned. And why should we be concerned? If you read the rest of the paragraph, the reasons for concern primarily are the economic strain that this puts in other ways. For example, if you have to spend more money on putting fuel in your car, you have less money for other things. So it does kind of put a strain on consumer spending. And if people don't spend, that obviously has adverse economic impact. It also increases debt. It also worsens the balance of payments deficits. So even though it does not have the kind of inflationary consequences that we have seen in the past, it's still not a good situation to be in, and we need to again be aware of this fact. Let's look at the next paragraph, and it will keep going because, as I said, it's a long passage. There are those who point out rightly that modern industrial capitalism has proved mightily resilient. Resilient means that it has bounced back from adversity. It has not really collapsed despite a lot of negative things happening. For example, the stock market crash, 9/11, rising oil prices, all of these have been thrown at it in the half decade since the millennium, but it has bounced back. On the whole, we have still continued to do well. Even so, there are at least 3 reasons for concern. So the author is saying, yes, we have survived so far, but does that mean that we should not be worried at all? The author believes we should be a little worried. The first reason for concern is we have been here before. And this, in fact, is what the author starts off by saying. Welcome to the Edwardian summer of the second age of globalization. The first age of globalization was at the time of the Industrial Revolution. At that time also, people were thinking everything's fine, everything is good, and then a lot happened. So similarly, we have been here before says that it feels like we're in similar times. At that time, people did not see change coming, and right now also, we don't see change coming. But we need to be prepared. In terms of political economy, the first era of globalization mirrored our own. There was belief in unfettered capital flows, in free migration. Eventually, though, there was a backlash. So ultimately, it did not end so well, and of course, we know why. There was World War I. So the argument that is being made here is that, yes, modern industrial capitalism has been resilient, but there are 3 reasons for concern, of which the first is that this resembles the first era of globalization. And of course, that did not end too well, so we need to be concerned about the consequences of what is happening now. Now, in this paragraph, we are highlighting the second reason for concern. If you remember, the author had said that there are at least 3 reasons. The first one we have covered. The second one is that the world is usually fragile when the global balance of power is in flux. And currently, that is the situation because if you remember, the US might be losing its overall dominance in the world. By the end of the 19th century, Britain's role as the hegemonic power was being challenged by the rise of the United States, Germany, and Japan, while the Ottoman and Habsburg empires were clearly in rapid decline. So you have to understand that the moment one power structure weakens, there will be others that will rush to fill in that gap. So in that case, at that time, in the first age of globalization, Britain was the world superpower. And since Britain was on the decline slightly, there were other countries that kind of rushed to fill in that gap, and that changed the power structure in the world. Similarly, right now, the US, even though it's pretty strong, may face a challenge from other countries. And which are these 2 countries? Luckily, India is one of them. It says, looking ahead from 2005, it is clear that over the next 2 or 3 decades, both China and India, which together account for half the world's population, will flex their muscles. So these are the 2 countries that might challenge the power of the US. As I said, this passage has a lot of relevance to today. So the argument here that we're making is that in general, at a time of change, the global power structure is a little fragile. In the past, we saw Britain being challenged by the US, Japan, and Germany. And currently, in the second age of globalization, we might see something similar happening for the US. So the US might be challenged by the rising might of China and hopefully India. And this is the last paragraph. Finally, there is the question of what rising oil prices tell us. So if you remember, the general perspective is that the oil prices will correct themselves, and the author does not really believe in that general perspective. And here the author is referring to that point again. Because China and India are growing economies and they will continue to grow, but we have already said that crude oil supplies are probably going to top out in the sense that they will not increase. They are whatever they are. These are limited resources. So in such cases, if there is a constraint from the supply side, what would we really expect? We would expect that on the whole, oil prices are going to rise in the long term. It's very simple logic. The demand is growing, supply is limited. So even though in the short term prices might fall, overall they're going to increase. So that's all that is being said in paragraph 8. That because of the demand that we see coming from these growing economies, rising oil prices are likely to continue following this trend. Now that we are done with the passage overall, what we need to think about is overall what is the author trying to say? the author has highlighted how we are living in an age of overconfidence, and maybe we should not be, because there are these 3 reasons for concern. So this is going to be my second pause. If you remember the 5 pause approach that we keep talking about, let's now take a look at our questions. By the expression Edwardian summer, the author refers to a period in which there is. I found this question a little difficult because when I was initially taking this paper way back, about more than a decade ago, I was not as well informed. So now I'm going to show you how this phrase has been referred to. It says, and crucially, it is a time when policymakers are confident that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. And right after that, the author is trying to say, welcome to the Edwardian summer of the second age of globalization. So I've already explained this to you when we were discussing the passage, what this Edwardian summer refers to. It refers to a time in which people believe everything is well when it actually is not. Keeping this in mind, let's look at our options. Unparalleled luxury and opulence. See, the word unparalleled should tell you that this is a bit of an extreme option. We're not saying that we have never seen such prosperity. We are saying generally, yes, there is prosperity. Plus, option 1 does not really refer to the negative tone of the author. There's nothing bad about option 1. So, option 1 we can eliminate. The second one could be our answer, a sense of complacency, because I've used this word several times. And this is what the author is trying to say when policymakers are confident that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. It's an extreme degree of overconfidence. And then the author is clearly trying to say that we shouldn't really be. So it could be option 2. Now the third one, a culmination of all-round economic prosperity. Culmination is like the highest point, the peak, but this is again not a bad thing. So we should eliminate the third option. The fourth one does have a negative tone. An imminent danger lurking behind economic prosperity. So I would actually be confused between these 2 options. The word imminent here is supposed to be important. It means something that is bound to happen, which also becomes an extreme word because the author is not saying that something bad is bound to happen. The author is merely trying to say, let's be a little more aware. But the author is not saying, stop doing whatever you're doing because something bad is definitely going to happen. It's not imminent. And therefore, we should eliminate option 4. Our answer is the second. So this is a question that is pretty easy to get wrong if you don't really think about it and don't work on the option elimination, right? So we just need to be a little careful. We need to look at this line that I have highlighted. Policymakers are confident, complacent. These are your clues. Let's look at the next question. What, according to the author, has resulted in a widespread belief in the resilience of modern capitalism? It's a specific detailed question. This is one that we should all get right. So if you look at paragraph 6, the author has highlighted what has resulted in the belief that modern capitalism is going to be there to stay, that it is resilient. It has apparently shrugged off everything, a stock market crash, 9/11 and rising oil prices. I'm not sure if you are aware of what 9/11 refers to, but it refers to a terrorist attack. So in case you don't know, please go back and refer to it. It was a pretty major event. It changed the world in a big way. So I'm just saying it's something you should know about. But for now, let's take a look at our options. Option 1 talks about growth in the economies of the Western countries despite shocks in the form of increase in levels of indebtedness and inflated asset prices. So first of all, yes, it does talk about increasing indebtedness, particularly in the US, but these are not the reasons why people would believe that modern capitalism is resilient. So it's not the answer to the current question. So let's eliminate the first option. Increase in the prosperity of Western countries and China despite rising oil prices. While again, this might be true, this is not the only reason. The reason as being highlighted in the passage is that despite a lot of these negative events, we have still managed to grow. So option 2 does not talk about this shrugging off the stock market crash in 9/11 and so on. So we should eliminate it. The third one, continued growth of Western economies despite a rise in terrorism. This refers to 9/11. Increase in oil prices, clearly mentioned, and other similar shocks which could refer to the stock market crash. So option 3 is pretty comprehensive. We keep it. The fourth one, the success of continued reforms aimed at making Western economies more dynamic. Reforms have been mentioned. The French have resisted those reforms, that has also been mentioned. But again, this is not the answer to the question being asked. It doesn't say that it is the success of the reforms that have powered the belief in the resilience of modern capitalism. So we eliminate the fourth option. I think this is a very simple question. The answer is option 3. Now, this one is something that you would definitely need to think about because you have to figure out the key argument made by the author. So, the easy way to do this would of course be to refer to some specific paragraphs where the author has clearly stated certain opinions. These are the paragraphs I would probably look at. In the first paragraph, the author has already said that despite certain parallels to history, we believe that everything is going well. In paragraph 6, it says, even so, there are at least 3 reasons for concern. So, the primary highlight of this passage is that we should be concerned, that we should not be overconfident. And these 3 concerns, the first is, we have been here before, so there are parallels to the first stage of globalization. Second, the world is traditionally at its most fragile at these times. And finally, there is the question of what oil prices are telling us. So, I would probably be focusing on these concerns when looking at the key argument of the author. Now, let's take a look at our first option. Now, here it says the rise in oil prices, flux in the global balance of power and historical precedents should make us question our belief that the current global economic prosperity would continue. It points to all the 3 factors that paragraphs 6, 7 and 8 have referred to. And in general, the author is trying to tell us that yes, maybe we should not be so confident. So option 1 looks good, we keep it. The second option is a little too definitive because the author says that the belief that modern industrial capitalism is highly resilient and capable of overcoming shocks will be belied soon. We are not saying that everything will come crashing down. The author is just saying maybe things are not as great as they seem to be. So option 2 we should eliminate. The third one, widespread prosperity leads to neglect of early signs of underlying economic weakness manifested in higher oil prices and a flux in the global balance of power. This is a trick option because it does again refer to the factors mentioned in paragraph 6, 7 and 8. So what is the difference between option 1 and option 3? Option 1 refers to the current time. So if you remember, the author has said right at the beginning, welcome to the Edwardian summer of the second age of globalization. We are trying to say right now we should be concerned. Option 3 is generic. It says generally widespread prosperity leads to neglect of early signs of underlying economic weakness. It may not be true all the time. The author is pointing to these signs in order to say that this is very similar to what happened in the past. But then I cannot say that this is always going to be the case whenever there is economic prosperity. So we should eliminate option 3. Option 4, a crisis is imminent in the West. See, this is a word that we have looked at with regard to another question. So now we know what it means. Imminent means bound to happen. But the author is never saying that it is bound to happen. And the author is also not only pointing to the growth of China and India. There are multiple reasons for concern. So eliminate option 4. Our answer has to be the first option. Even though it's a key argument question, I think if you have understood the passage, this is easy to figure out. Now, let's take a look at this particular question. This is interesting because you need to understand the reference. What can be inferred about the author's view when he states, as Tommy Cooper used to say, just like that? I think it's a fairly difficult question unless your mind is pretty analytical and you don't panic. So let's look at the text. The accepted wisdom is that we shouldn't worry our little heads about that. Here we're referring to oil prices going up because the incentives are there for business to build new production and refining capacity. What I would do is that I would probably break up this paragraph and try to understand it in bits and pieces, because whenever there is a reference to a specific part of the passage, basically it's a logical structure question, right? They're asking you what is the larger point that the author is trying to make. So I cannot only refer to that statement. I have to refer to the larger point that the statement is trying to get us to understand. So how do I interpret this? First, this part is sarcastic. The author is trying to say that they don't agree with accepted wisdom. Now here is equal to he or she / they. So let's not pay too much attention to that right now. And how do I sense the sarcasm? We shouldn't worry our little heads about that. Okay, so that is where you need to sense the sarcasm. After that, Tommy Cooper was a British comedian. He had this range of magic tricks which always failed, and he was also famous for saying just like that, and of course it never worked. So we are also trying to say here that just like Tommy Cooper's magic tricks, demand and supply will not magically bring about change and price correction. Now that I have understood this, let's take a look at our options. Industry has incentives to build new production and refining capacity, and therefore oil prices would reduce. The author does not think this is necessarily going to be the case. This is what people believe. Eliminate option 1. There would be a correction in the price level of oil once new production capacity is added. Definitely not. The author is not saying that oil prices will correct themselves just like that. So option 2 is gone. The decline in oil prices is likely to be short-term in nature. Now, this may not necessarily be mentioned here, but elsewhere in the passage it is mentioned that whatever declines in oil prices we might see, they are likely to be cyclical and short-term. In the longer term, since there will be supply-side constraints, but the demand is not likely to go down, overall oil prices are going to continue to rise. So option 3 might work. Now let's take a look at option 4. I would honestly be confused between 3 and 4 because option 4 is also saying that oil prices are not necessarily going to decline. So how do I differentiate between these two options? I look at the text just before the quote. Again, for logical structure questions, this is the standard technique that I recommend. It says that on the whole, business will build new production and refining capacity, which will effortlessly bring demand and supply back into balance and bring crude prices back to $25 a barrel. Back to $25 a barrel, which means probably this is something that was there earlier, and from $25 it's gone to about $65. So we are trying to say that, on the whole, we might be going back to the earlier prices. But the author says in general that we're not likely to go back to earlier prices. So let's not think that way. Now let's look at 3. As I said, this is a point that has been made elsewhere in the passage, so it is not necessarily untrue. But when we are referring to this particular quote, I would have to refer to the purpose of this particular quote. So I would eliminate the third option because $25 a barrel refers to the price point earlier. How do I know that? Back to $25 a barrel. So this tiny detail might help you decide that it is option 4 and not option 3. So this brings us to the end of the first passage. We still have one more to do. Keep watching. The second passage seems to be even more complex as compared to the first, and it is because it is an abstract passage. What I would like to do in such passages is to focus on some central concepts that we definitely need to understand. Maybe we won't be able to answer all 4 questions, but even if I can answer 2 correctly, I'd be pretty happy. So as we read this, it talks about Derrida's work, and it says that it's pretty complex, but it has been influential with regard to the analysis of the ways in which language structures our understanding of ourselves and the world we inhabit, an approach he termed deconstruction. So clearly this passage is about Derrida's deconstructive approach. Now, if I simply focus on that word, I think it tells us a lot about what this approach is going to be like. We are going to look at hidden meanings in the language. That is what deconstruction really is. And the very next line says exactly that. In its simplest formulation, deconstruction can be taken to refer to a strategy which seeks to uncover layers of hidden meaning in a text that have been denied or suppressed. Now, I really may not be able to see how certain meanings can be suppressed in text. For example, if I write a particular sentence, by means of that sentence, I intend to convey a certain message. How could something be hidden in that message if I don't intend for it to be hidden? And this is where Derrida comes in. Derrida is going to prove, as we read later, that even though my intention may be to say X, I might have ended up saying certain other things simply by not referring to them. Now, we will get to that. As of now, let's just focus on this particular paragraph. When it says uncovering hidden meanings in text, text here is not just words or sentences. It could be anything that we produce and reproduce constantly in our social relations. So this part honestly lost me a little bit. So I'm just going to think of text as text because it's easier for me to understand. Then it says that Derrida's work or deconstructive approach is basically a critique of something called logocentrism. Now, what is logocentrism? Not logocentrism, sorry, logocentrism. It is the search for some rational language that can cover everything or describe everything accurately. Now here, we don't really have any such language today, but I can probably think of, let's say, the language of science. What is science really trying to do today? It is trying to explain all aspects of the world around us. So if science had a language, it would be very similar to what Derrida is probably talking about when it talks about logocentrism. Could we possibly have a language that is able to describe everything perfectly? Derrida is saying that this approach itself is kind of wrong, because when we search for a rational language that tries to represent the world in all its aspects, anything that does not fit into this language, we will simply set aside. We will say, oh, that's not important. That is what marginalization is. So now let's take science as an example. Trust me, I am not trying to say that we should not make scientific progress. I'm just taking it as an example. So for example, let's say that there are a lot of things that science as of today cannot explain. For example, possession, let's say, or superstition of certain forms. But what do we really say? We say, oh, these are just paranormal activities, or these are just pseudosciences, or basically that, this is not really relevant. It's not even something that we want to try to explain, because it does not fit into the worldview that science has today. It's not something that can be justified or explained by evidence. So this is just one example of how the search for a rational language can marginalize or suppress certain things that do not fit into that language. Then it says, thus logocentrism has in its search for the truth of absolute representation subsumed difference and oppressed that which it designates as its alien other. For Derrida, Western civilization has been built upon such a systematic assault on alien cultures and ways of life, typically in the name of reason and progress. So if you look at it historically, when colonialism was spreading through the world and the Westerners came to, say, India and other similar colonies, they also decided that certain practices or certain concepts or ideas that we had were simply illogical and therefore not important and should be done away with. So when English spread through a particular colony, in the spread of that language, it also got rid of certain ideas and notions as being irrelevant, because it simply did not have any words to represent those ideas. So what have we really done? We have simply decided to do away with anything that is alien to the English language. Again, just as an example, not a critique of English, because that would be ironic, because that's what I'm trying to teach you. But coming back to what we are saying here, effectively, therefore, the argument that is being made is that Derrida's deconstructive approach is a critique of something called logocentrism. And why is it a critique? It says that logocentrism has historically marginalized or suppressed differences because it's trying to look for a rational and representative language that can explain all aspects of the world. And this has given rise to authoritarian structures. Let's move to the next paragraph. Now, in response to logocentrism, deconstruction posits or suggests that the mechanism by which this process of marginalization and ordering of truth occurs is through establishing systems of binary opposition. So this paragraph is going to explain binary opposition. And if you look at the examples, it's pretty easy to understand. For example, when we say rational, irrational, good, bad, these words are opposites. They're nothing but antonyms. But what Derrida is trying to say is that they are not mere opposites. One of these words is superior to the other. For example, good is better than bad. Rational is better than irrational. Culture is kind of better than nature. So if you read further, line number 4 says, rather they exist for Derrida in a series of hierarchical relationships, with the first term normally occupying a superior position. So why do we always say good and bad? Why don't we say bad and good? Because we're used to this system of opposition, where the first word is usually the desirable one and the second word is not. And Derrida is trying to tell us that this is not a coincidence. This is something that has been deliberately done over time. As we read further, it says, this refers to the realization that in any statement, oppositional terms differ from each other, And at the same time, a hierarchical relationship is maintained by the deference of one term to the other. So, bad is always supposed to be inferior to good. Irrational is supposed to be inferior to rational. It is this latter point which is the key to understanding Derrida's approach to deconstruction. So, basically, we're explaining the system of binary opposition, which is not merely opposite words, but also a system in which we are maintaining a hierarchical relationship between these concepts by putting the more superior term first. So, that's all this paragraph is about. Derrida's deconstruction critiques binary opposition by showing how they create hierarchical relationships. Now, as I point this out to you, I'm sure a lot of you would be thinking, hey, I never looked at language that way. So, you already see the brilliance of Derrida's deconstructivist approach. Let's move on to paragraph 3. For the fact at any given time, one term must defer to its oppositional other means that the two terms are constantly in a state of interdependence. Now, what does this mean? In order for me to understand rational, I need to understand irrational and vice versa, and it explains that further. The presence of one is dependent upon the absence or absent presence of the other, such as in the case of good and evil. So, how do we know something is good? Because it is not evil. That is what absent presence refers to. In order for us to understand good, it will require an absence of evil, but we don't really think about it that way, at least not consciously. Put simply, deconstruction represents an attempt to demonstrate the absent presence of this oppositional other to show that what we say or write is in itself not expressive simply because of what is present, but also because of what is absent. Now, this is where the passage kind of gets complex, because a lot of times when we say things, we don't really think about what we are not saying. Although if you start thinking about that, it really gives you an insight into what people really are thinking. So, for example, if I say that ice cream is good, right? What does that really mean? I'm also trying to say that it does not have any of the characteristics that I typically associate with being bad. This is the absence or absent presence of the characteristics of bad. But are we really going to process language that way or text that way? No. Derrida is trying to tell us, let's think about it. Let's look at how it is not always about what we are saying, but also about what we are not saying. Now, if you look at the last quote, it says, in Derrida's own words, a deconstructive reading must always aim at a certain relationship, unperceived by the writer, between what he commands and what he does not command of the patterns of a language that he uses. This is exactly what happens when we speak or write. We feel that we are conveying a message that we have decided to convey, but we don't really look at how the language already has certain rules which are not within our command. We have to use language in that particular way. We don't have a choice. So, in conveying a certain message, we end up also probably conveying other things which we never intended to. Now, let's stay with this thought. The argument here is that Derrida's deconstructive approach reveals the interdependence of oppositional terms. Remember, we talked about binary opposites in the previous paragraph. And this shows that the meaning is shaped not only by what is being said, but also by what is not being said, the oppositional term. For example, when we say that something is good, it is equal to saying it is not evil. So let's start thinking about what is absent in a message in order to truly understand the implications of that message. The last paragraph now. Meaning then is never fixed or stable, whatever the intention of the author of a text. By now, if you have understood everything that I have said earlier, this should be pretty evident. I may want to convey a certain message, but the message is not only what I intend to convey, because language itself is not entirely at my command. Since it is a system of these binary opposites and hierarchical relationships, a lot of times I may convey what I have not intended to also. For Derrida, language is a system of relations that are dynamic, in that all meanings we ascribe to the world are dependent not only on what we believe to be present, but also on what is absent. So, as I said, when we say that something is rational, it is equal to saying it is not irrational. That's basically it. Now, it says that no meaning can therefore ever be definitive, but is merely an outcome of a particular interpretation. So, in this paragraph, we're trying to highlight two things. Number one, the author is not in control of the meaning. That is what it says, when it says that Derrida rejects the idea of the definitive authority of the intentional agent or subject. Regardless of what I intend to convey, the meaning is not fully within my control because the rules of the language are not fully within my control. So the argument here is that meaning of the text is never fixed. It does not really depend on the author or the subject. Language depends on both what the author intends and what is absent from their intention. So now we have understood or tried to understand most of the passage. Let's take a look at the questions, which, believe it or not, are not as complicated as we would think they would be. Now, this question says, according to the passage, Derrida believes that. This could be inferential, it could be just a specific detail-based question, we don't really know, but we will be referring to the text. Paragraph 1 and paragraph 3. Now, since paragraph 3 is a little complicated, I have translated it or tried to translate it into simple English. What we are saying in paragraph 3 is that a deconstructive reading of the text should focus on the unseen relationship between two things. First, what the writer controls, which is the message that I intend to convey, and also what the author does not control. For example, these systems of hierarchical relationships in the language that they're using. And that can add to the message. It can add layers of meaning to the message that even the author may not perceive. Now let's take a look at our options. Reality can be construed only through the use of rational analysis. First of all, pause at the word only. Also, if you look at paragraph 1, this is logocentrism. Logocentrism is the search for a rational language that is able to know and represent the world in all its aspects perfectly and accurately. Clearly, rational analysis is not something that Derrida will support or believe. So, option 1 is gone. Language limits our construction of reality. See, this is a common sense option. It seems like Derrida is criticizing language, but it's not that. It's not language that is the problem. When we say text, it's not necessarily only language. Derrida is trying to say that we need to uncover hidden layers of meaning in language. Therefore, option 2 is not relevant. Let's eliminate. A universal language will facilitate a common understanding of reality. This is logocentrism again. Rational language that is able to know and represent the world perfectly and accurately. But Derrida does not think this is the right way to go because this leads to authoritarian structures. So, option 3 should be eliminated. The fourth one, we need to uncover the hidden meaning in a system of relations expressed by language. This is what paragraph 3 talks about. Derrida supports a deconstructive reading. What is deconstructive reading? Look at not only what is present, but what is also absent. So, these are the hidden meanings that are expressed in language, which is why option 4 is your answer. Now, this next question clearly is very specific to Derrida. Logocentrism does not imply. So, we need to understand what is being said about logocentrism. We'll refer to paragraph 1 and 2. The first option says a totalitarian impulse. Well, if you look at paragraph 1, it clearly says that logocentrism is a totalitarian impulse of the Enlightenment to bring all that exists in the world under the domain of representative language. This, in fact, is the definition of logocentrism. So, option 1 must be eliminated. A domain of representative language. In the same line, we talk about how it is the pursuit of representative language. So, this is definitely an aspect of logocentrism. We eliminate option 2. Option 3 says interdependence of the meanings of dichotomous terms. Dichotomous here means opposite in a way. Now, if you have understood what deconstruction says in paragraph 2, you would clearly see that interdependence of dichotomous terms is something that deconstruction talks about. This is not logocentrism. Therefore, option 3 is very likely to be your answer. The fourth one, a strategy that seeks to suppress hidden meanings in a text. Well, in a way, yes. If you look at paragraph 1, the last part says, thus, logocentrism has, in its search for truth of absolute representation, subsumed difference and oppressed that which it designates as the alien other. So, it tries to do away with things that do not really fit into that representative language. And deconstruction is trying to uncover those hidden layers of meaning. And therefore, option 4 seems to support the logocentric approach rather than the deconstruction approach. So, we eliminate option 4. Option 3 clearly is a part of deconstruction and therefore, it is not logocentrism. That becomes our answer. This promises to be a somewhat simple question because it says according to the passage. So normally this is just a specific detailed question. According to the passage, Derrida believes that the system of binary opposition. So let's read about binary opposition in paragraph 2. We will refer to the text as and when we need to. Option 1 represents a prioritization or hierarchy. This is clearly mentioned in the second paragraph. It says very clearly in the last point here, rather they exist in a series of hierarchical relationships in which the first term is superior to the second. For example, good, bad. So, one in fact is true. The second one reconciles contradictions and dualities. It doesn't reconcile, it just posits one term as better than the other. So, option 2 cannot be our answer. Weakens the process of marginalization. In fact, if you look at the first point, this is how marginalization takes place. It is not weakening marginalization. So, option 3 is not accurate. Deconstructs reality. Well, the deconstructivist approach deconstructs reality, or at least deconstructs text. This system of binary opposition does not, and therefore option 4 is not our answer. As I said, fairly simple question. This option 1 is your answer. It's directly stated in paragraph 2. Now, when I look at this question, I would say, okay, this could be complicated because it has a because in it. Whenever it is a because question, please make sure that you do not pick an option that is generally true. It might be mentioned somewhere in the passage. You need to pick an option that supplies the reason for whatever idea has been presented here. So we need a reason for why Derrida rejects the idea of the definitive authority of the subject. Of course, if I don't understand the concept, I should give up on this question straight away. But let's refer to the text. In paragraph 4, if you look at the last point, this insight leads once again to Derrida's further rejection of the idea of the definitive authority of the intentional agent or subject. What does this really mean? What Derrida is saying is that the author of the text may have certain things that they want to convey, but when we interpret the text, we cannot only refer to the author's intention because the meaning will depend on what the author did not intend also. Why does this happen? Because language is a system of binary opposites. The author may not really consciously be aware of this structure, and therefore, when I say something, I also need to pay attention to what I'm not saying, which normally the author will not be aware of. Now, once we've understood this much, let's take a look at our options. Interpretation of the text may not make the unseen visible. So, when the author intends something, the author is only aware of the intended message. The author is not aware of what they are not saying. So, if I say that the meaning is dependent on the author's intention, I will never truly get the meaning, at least not from the deconstruction approach. Derrida is saying that we have to read text differently, not only look at what the author is trying to say, but also what the author is not saying. And that is why we must reject the authority of the subject, because if we only rely on the authority of the subject, then our interpretation may not be able to look at the unseen text. Option 1, therefore, we need to keep. The second, the meaning of the text is based on binary opposites. While this is very close to the answer, this is not the only part. The author is trying to say that the author's intention matters, but what the author is not saying also matters. And one of the contributing factors is this system of binary opposites. But this is just part of the argument. This is not the entire argument, and therefore we eliminate the second option. The implicit power relationship is often ignored. Well, we're not really sure what power relationship is being talked about here. If you're referring to the hierarchical relationship between these binary opposites, maybe. But again, just like option 2, option 3 is also just part of the argument. So we eliminate option 3. Any act of interpretation must refer to what the author intends. While this may be true, Derrida is actually trying to argue in the other direction, that if we rely only on the author, then we may not be able to see all the things the author is not saying, and therefore we may not have a complete understanding of the text. So the author's intention, according to Derrida, is not the most important part. So we eliminate the fourth option. Now, how would I really solve this question? I would solve this question by looking at that phrase, definitive authority of the agent or subject. And since it says this insight leads to, I would look at the sentence just before that. And this sentence matches option 1 pretty closely. So I would say, okay, option 1 looks to be the answer. I'm fairly certain of it, and therefore I say this is my answer. So this passage, clearly challenging. It would be completely understandable if I were taking the paper and chose not to do it. But if you do get stuck with a passage like this, always keep the hope that there will be 1 or 2 questions that you will be able to solve. All the best for CAT this year.